That's right, AWS Panorama is now generally available. I'm very grateful to AWS for sending this to me for the purpose of this video. They don't have any editorial control over this video though, so everything that you see here is going to be either my opinion or my experience of using this actual device for the very first time. Panorama is a rugged device. It has some kinds of protection against dust and against water, which means you can put it into hostile environments. It is pretty ruggedized. It's got this weatherproof flap on the front, and in there you've got a HDMI port and you've got a USB port, which is going to be used for provisioning. On the back, we've got power, and we've got a couple of different network connections, so you can put this onto a couple of different networks. Now, I've not used this particular device before. This is the actual general available. This is going to be what is shipped. This is the production unit. You might have seen that I did a video about the preview device. The preview device worked differently. And if you're interested in the differences between the preview device and this device, then maybe take a look at the link in the corner. I'll have a video on that, but most people will be interested to know how this device actually works. I've not used this one yet. What I have done is obviously I've got some knowledge about how they've worked in the past, and I've also taken a look at a lot of the documentation just in preparation for this session, hopefully getting this up and running today with some camera feeds going directly into it. So just to talk a little bit about the setup that I've got here, obviously the Panorama device itself, I've got power and network waiting to plug into the device. This device doesn't have Wi-Fi. It might have the physical capability, but it doesn't get to be configured with Wi-Fi. We are now looking at physical network connection. I've also got HDMI cable ready to plug into it as well, so that we can see the output from this on the monitor if it doesn't fall off the table. Okay, so that's what we've got over there. Over on this side, obviously, I've got my laptop. It's currently logged into the AWS console. I've also got this security camera, which is right here. This is a Vivotech IP-based security camera. It is listed as being specifically compatible with this unit, but anything really with an RTSP stream probably should do. This is set up with a username and password. It's secured. I've also got another one that's actually on the front of my house pointing out to the driveway at the moment, and we'll look at hooking it up to that one as well. Now, in addition to that, in terms of what I've done to set up here, if we just look on my machine, if I just go over to GitHub and look at AWS Panorama, we should find from a quick Google search this samples and test utility. This is a repo that the team has put together, the Panorama team has put together for a test utility for essentially allowing you to be able to preview and develop code inside of an EC2 instance as a simulator or as a test utility before you put code onto the actual device itself. It will also help us put the applications onto the device itself as well. Now, this repo here has a button in it on the README page to help you launch a cloud formation stack in either US East 1 or US West 2 to build one of these EC2 instances. They are ARM-based instances. Follow the instructions here. You do have to go and subscribe to a particular marketplace AMI to get the Ubuntu 18.04 LTS Bionic ARM AMI. So once you've done that, you can then build this instance up. It takes about anywhere between about 20 minutes to 40 minutes to actually build up and install all of the packages it needs. So I've done that already. I've then followed the rest of the instructions through with how to connect to the device. Essentially what it does is it sets you up with an SSH tunnel to connect your browser through to the actual running environment. We'll talk more about this and a little about that setup in just a moment. What we'll do now though is we'll jump into the AWS console and we'll have a look at the Panorama console and we'll look at the steps we need to follow to actually get this device set up. I've not done this before, not with this device, so let's see what happens. So let's search for Panorama and head in. Imagine this is all going to be fairly straightforward to start with. And once we're in there, we're just going to follow the bouncing ball, let's say get started. And we've got a bit of a procedure here to follow. So the first thing that we need to do is add the device. Apparently this takes 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to click Add Device. Nothing happened this time. And so we scroll down and we say Begin Setup. So we have to have a name for our device. So this is going to be my Panorama. Description, I'm not going to do that for now. Tags, not going to do that for now. Let's click next. Plug in the cables and power on your device. Okay, well, I'm ready to do that. So I'm going to plug in the network first. I don't think it matters, but I'm going to plug it into Ethernet 0, which of course is the first port, and I'm going to plug in power. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to plug in the HDMI cable because I want to see what it says. I don't think we need to see what it says, but I'm going to plug that in. I'm not plugging in keyboard and mouse. I don't think there's going to be any need to see that. And I'm going to plug it in. Now, one thing I have noticed with these devices in the past is that when you plug in power, it immediately turns on. So it has got that power on power resumption. It's going to start. And we noticed it had that panorama display there. And otherwise, it's just booting up into Linux. And I'm presuming it's going to be an Ubuntu operating system. Anyway, it's in its process. It's logging. It's booting up now. Let's do that. I'm just going to follow the procedure here. Next. Configure networking for your device. So it's got some options here to do advanced networking. Let's see what options it's got available. I've clicked advanced. I've got the two different Ethernet ports, Ethernet port 0, Ethernet port 1, and the options are to obtain IP address with DHCP, or you can go and add in a particular IP address that you want it to have, and presumably you can do that for both ports. I've only used port 0, as you know, and I'm fine with it using DHCP. So we're going to leave it with that. I'm going to click save. The thing to notice here is that there's no Wi-Fi. It is cabled only. Okay, there we go. It's finished booting up now, and we've got Ubuntu 18.04.4 LTS, as we probably expected to see. So let's scroll down and click next. And it's taking a little moment here to perform this task. We'll have to see what it comes back with. It could be generating a configuration pack, and it is. So it's got an archive here it's put together. These are going to be the certificates, Greengrass certificates and things like that, if I'm not mistaken, that we can give to this device so that it can connect into the AWS console and link up with our account. Let's download this archive, and I'm going to save it. And I've got it here in my download. And what it's saying to do here is transfer this file onto a USB storage device. And handily, when we opened up the box, it actually gave us a USB storage device. And it is here. I've not opened it yet, but it's inside of this package. And there it is. Yes, nothing special. I'm not anticipating there's anything on here at all. So let's plug this in. And I'm going to copy the file over. So let's do that. It's going to pick it up and drag it. And yes, now it's on that USB memory drive. Let's unmount that. This configuration file will expire in 5 minutes. That's interesting to see. So let's crack on with it. Okay, plug the USB storage device into your device. That's presumably this. So let's go ahead and do that. Make sure it's the right way round. And I'm going to plug it into USB type 2 just because it's easier to do. I don't think it matters. And now we wait. So I presume what's happening now is that this device is reading the files on there, reading that configuration, the certificates and all the rest of it, loading it into the configuration of the Panorama, and reaching out to my AWS console. I suppose all we do now is wait, see what happens. Okay, it didn't take very long at all. And it says, your appliance, My Panorama, is now connected and online. Let's click next and see what happens. It's just giving us some next steps here, software updates, all of the other things, stuff to read. Let's click done. And we are through the first step. Now it's saying that we should add some camera streams. Apparently this is going to take between 5 and 10 minutes. Let's see if we can do it a little bit quicker than that. So I've got 2 camera streams that are available on my network, which is the same network as is plugged into the back of the device here. This camera and the one on the front of the house. So let's say add camera streams. It's saying give me a name. So let's say this is a Studio Cam, as in the one that's right here. And we're going to go down. It says, please give me the RTSP URL. And I have that handily here. So I'm going to paste that into there. That's the RTSP stream. I also have some credentials on this. So let's type in the username and password for this particular stream. And I can paste that password into there and click save. Okay, so it's creating that data source now. So it'll be interesting to see what it's doing there, I would be interested to know if it's actually communicating with this device and then communicating with the stream and validating that it's even there, or is it just creating a data object inside of Panorama? I suspect that potentially the second one. Let's go and add another data source, driveway cam. We've got a URL for that one, and we have a username and a password for that, which I'll paste in there and click save on that. Okay, I notice that the status of these at the moment is creating. I might press refresh on the whole thing. Oh, there we go, created. Okay, we've got 2 camera streams created. If I click on one, what do we see? I see details of it, but I don't actually get to see the camera streams itself. Of course, here, I'm logged into the AWS console. It's not on my internal network, so it can't see these camera streams. And I guess that's kind of the point, is that the streams are processed locally. We don't have to send this camera stream up to the internet. So if you have sensitive camera feeds that you don't want to have going outside of your network, then a device like this works really well. But also, you don't have to send many different camera streams in high quality up to the internet for low latency inference and for detection. You can do it all here on this device running locally. So that's set up. I don't think there's much more I can do with that. Let's go back to AWS Panorama and navigate back into devices. And there's the device. Okay, update needed. I was told that this might happen. So from the time that it's shipped to the time that I'm plugging it in right now, a new software update is out with just performance tweaks and also some security enhancements, things like that apparently. So let's click on the device itself. And yeah, here we go. Software update required. I'm going to install a software update. And it's telling me that there are, how many versions? Just one version to update to. So we're going to update to that. How do I select that? Whoops. Oh, select it over here. There we go. You have to select it with this little radio button right over the side here and click install. And it says you can't cancel an update after it starts. Do you want to continue? Yes, I do. Okay, let's click confirm. And off it goes. Installing software update 4.3.4. Estimated time, 60 minutes. So while it's doing that, this is probably an ideal time to have a look at the test utility, see how it works, and start to get a grips with how the applications actually work on the device. How you put together an application, how you insert your own model, all that kind of stuff. So let's jump over to the test utility that I talked about before. Now, I'll remind you that this was actually built through a CloudFormation stack from that GitHub repository, which is here. So if you go to the AWS Panorama Samples and Test Utility repository, the fan's spinning up on Panorama device here as it's doing its software update. Anyway, so if you go through this process and build up this stack, it is worthwhile just checking the stack and just checking to see the template that it's actually going to launch. It does leave, at the moment, a couple of ports open to the outside world. It does ask you for your IP address so that maybe it can lock it down, but it doesn't actually use those variables inside of the CloudFormation stack itself. So I've gone and tightened that up in as a post step after it's actually been built. So probably what I'm going to say here is take these stacks, build them up in a non-production account, build them up in a test account, a sandpit environment where you're experimenting around with this device, you're understanding how it works, because you're going to learn a whole bunch about the way that you deploy software to these devices and ultimately how you're going to manage a fleet of these devices in the long term. So let's jump into the Jupyter Notebook environment. It's Jupyter Labs. This is not SageMaker Studio. This is not SageMaker Notebooks. This is an EC2 instance running in my account that I've got some instructions from AWS to do an SSH tunnel through to it so that it's actually presenting, as you can see on my box, as localhost because I'm doing that SSH tunnel. But this is all running up in the cloud. Now, there's a significant benefit, I think, to doing it this way, especially if you want to get up and running quickly, because AWS obviously have configured this environment already for us, but it's also running on the appropriate type of EC2 instance where you can compile code and compile models that will work on the Panorama device, because under the hood here, we've got a Jetson Xavier NVIDIA core. So it's an AMD core running inside of this device. And so over here in our EC2, we have an AMD device running in AWS Cloud configured in just the right way. So here I am on an Intel Mac, and obviously there are M1 Macs and there are PCs and all the rest of it, but in order to maintain compatibility, we're doing it here. In addition to that, they've already installed the CLI tools. So this is the Panorama CLI tools, which are really instrumental in deploying applications to this device. It's not so much point and click in the console, as far as I've seen so far. It's much more about the code. And of course, in a production environment, that's what you're going to be doing. So here we have this environment, and if I navigate through to here, we can actually see some of the samples. It's already got a whole bunch of stuff installed. It's got a whole bunch of MXNet libraries installed. It's also got the CLI, the Panorama CLI installed. Let's go into AWS Panorama samples. In there, we've got a folder called samples. Inside of there, we've got essentially three folders, 2 projects, and a Panorama SDK. So the people counter, the car tracker, and the Panorama SDK. The Panorama SDK is a bunch of code which is essentially doing some of the simulation of what the Panorama device would look like and how it operates. And the others are projects that we can play around with. Let's have a go with people counter. So I'm going to open that up. And inside there, we've got an IPYNB notebook, and we've got some extra files. Let's go and have a look at the notebook and load that up. And so we're going to use this as the basis for the first project that we're going to try and deploy to this device. I notice here it's going through its update process. So we'll just leave it to do this, and we'll check back in with the console from time to time to see how well it's doing. But we expect this is going to take some time. So let's take a look at how a Panorama application project is packaged up and sent to the device. And we can see that with the way that this code has been written inside of this sample notebook. So this sample notebook is split up into several sections, as you might imagine. This top part, in fact, the first 3 code cells are really just getting going, obviously loading libraries and getting the parameters set for delivering the rest of the notebook. So I'm going to run these, but we'll look briefly at what we've got inside of here. And straight away I've hit a problem. I must specify a region, and this is because I didn't follow the instructions. I've done this so many times that you kind of feel like you don't need to read instructions anymore. I need to go to the command line of this box and configure the AWS environment to tell it what region I'm in by default. So let's go to plus here, go and get ourselves a terminal, and we'll just type in AWS config. And I'm not going to set the default access keys because this machine has got a role, so that's fine. And I'm going to type in US East 1, which is everybody's default region, right? I'm going to click OK on that, but it's also where this instance is actually running. And then I'm going to ignore that. And now I should have my environment set up with the default region. So let's try that one more time. I'm going to go to kernel, restart, and clear outputs. I do a lot of that when working with this notebook because you just want to start from afresh. Let's try that one more time. I'm going to run Shift-Enter to run that cell, and it looks much better. It's going through and loading in the libraries now. So it's loading in Bodo 3, the Python library for AWS, of course. It's also loading in there for a Panorama client in Bodo 3, a bunch of operating system style stuff, and some sort of background stuff with the way that this notebook is going to run. It's got all of that loaded. Let's go down and start to look at the guts of the actual Panorama deployment stuff itself. So here, the first thing we have to do is we have to enter in the device ID. Now, if you're doing this without a device, you're playing around with this because you want to see and experiment how Panorama works, you can just fill in nonsense, like I don't have a Panorama yet, please send me one into here. Nobody will send you a Panorama, but it will make the code work. Let's go over to the Panorama console. My device is still in the process of updating. Let's go and grab the device UUID. Is that what it wants? I think that's what it wants. I'm going to copy that. Let's go back to check to see what it wanted. Device ID, it says. Yeah, and it should look like this, device hyphen. So if I look over here, that's exactly what I have. So I've got that copied. I'm going to go back to the code, and I'm going to paste that into there. Okay, so that's good. The next thing I need to enter in here is an S3 bucket that it can use just to store artifacts as it's going through the process. I have actually got an S3 bucket already created, but I can't remember exactly what it's called. So I'll just grab that AWS Panorama review video. Let's paste that into that to use that as my S3 bucket. AWS region is being set again, is explicitly in code. And we have a model name here of SSD 512 ResNet 50, specifically for this project, this people counter project. So let's go ahead and shift enter on that. So that's all loaded in and configured. It's just setting a bunch of variables at this point. And then another one here, which is really just setting up some of the environment variables, if you like. So it's saying where it's working on this EC2 instance to be able to put all of the builds together and the rest of it. Just going to accept exactly what's default. We don't really need to deal with that too much, and we'll move on. What I might do at this point is we're just going to take a look here. We've got the people counter app folder on the side. If we open up that, then here you can see assets, deployment overrides, graphs, and packages. This is the guts of what a Panorama project will actually end up looking like. Your stuff inside of here. But what they've got here is basically the outline, if you like, of where to put the files before they get compiled into the actual overall project. So assets there, waiting for things like the models, deployment overrides. We'll talk more about this as we step through. The code also talks us through what some of these things are, and the graphs. So the graphs, these are JSON structures which actually build together the different components of a Panorama project. So this is more complex than just a simple function and a model. We're talking about how do you want to specify the outputs to HDMI? How do you want to specify which models you're using and which inference code you're using? All of this stuff all gets put into these graphs. So if I navigate into here and have a look at this, I'm going to open it with the editor so we can actually see what it looks like. And you can see the overview of the base people counter graph at the moment before any overrides or anything like this has happened. And you can see the code, the model, the HDMI data sync, in other words, data coming out of the HDMI port, and these abstract media source. In other words, it's a representation of where the data is going to come from. So all of this is configured up in code like this. There are tools and bits of code here in this notebook that make this easier for you than having to actually edit this by hand. But ultimately, if you're putting together pipelines that are going to deploy lots of different kinds of projects, or if this is what your consultancy ends up working on, then this is the kind of stuff that you're going to need to get to know how it works. Let's go back to the notebook and continue to scroll down. We are now going to set up the application. There's a couple of cells of code here which really are very much Jupyter-centric about getting the environment in the right space, clearing out the command line, that kind of stuff, which is what I've just done there. This line right here is the important line. We're going to use the Panorama CLI to actually kick the process off and import application. So let's go ahead and do that. This is doing the important stuff in the back end. It's basically going and setting up the notion of the fact that there is now an application. We can start to throw data in here. Ultimately, down the bottom, we can use the Panorama CLI to deploy to the device. Let's go here and just clean that up. And so now we're kind of ready to go. Now the Panorama CLI is actually installed on this machine. You've also got all of the code on this machine for the Panorama CLI, of course, so you can just go in and have a look at that. And you'll find that the majority of it is actually just abstracting you away from the AWS CLI. So the AWS CLI has that abstraction on top of the Panorama SDK or Panorama API. And in order to make the jobs a little bit easier, like kicking off an application or deploying something to the device, the Panorama CLI wraps up those calls in convenient ways to be able to help you along on the journey without making your life really difficult. So that's what that's doing. Let's go down now and have a look at the next step. It says import model. So we're just going to run this. This is actually running utils download model. Now, if you're wondering where all of this stuff is, utils is something that we included up at the top of this notebook. And if we navigate back down here and down here in the file structure, if you go into Panorama SDK, there is a utils.py. If we go into there, there's a whole bunch of, again, convenience code to help progress us quickly into deploying onto our Panorama device. So it is downloading the model. So I'm going to enter on that. And if you really want to know exactly what that's actually doing, we could jump into that code and see. We'd see that what it's actually doing there is just downloading a model that's available from a public web endpoint inside of S3, essentially some kind of model zoo, because the model that we're using for this is actually a well-known pre-trained model, which is actually pre-trained with a standard data set. It's a people counter. Under the hood, it's actually going to be counting potentially a whole bunch of stuff, but the code essentially filters it out to 2 people. We'll maybe change this to a car counter because I've got a driveway out front with a couple of cars on it. So let's try that. Let's go down and run the next cell. This is just uploading that then back up into S3. We're taking it down out of AWS's own S3 bucket, uploading it into our S3 bucket specifically for this project. Then we get to the kind of important one. Here we have utilities compile model. Under the hood, what this is doing, if we go and have a look at the actual code for compile model, is it's using the SageMaker SDK to use Neo to compile this particular model for this particular hardware. This is one of the critical parts, and it's nice that it's built it into this notebook. So essentially you could in principle take a model which is just generally created and generally compiled, recompile it with Neo in this step. So let's go and click Shift Enter on that. It's off and running, and it's now doing a compilation job. Now, this notebook instance that we have running here is actually pretty large, and it's not actually the kind of notebook that you want to leave running for any amount of time, trust me. It's an expensive notebook. But the compilation job which is happening here isn't happening on this notebook, so there's an argument to be made that you could run this on a much smaller instance. This compilation job is happening inside of SageMaker with the SageMaker compilation job with a container running there. We can see that if we go back out and go to the console, if we go to SageMaker and we jump into there, I'm just going to open it in a new tab. Oh, by the way, it has successfully upgraded this appliance. I don't think that took 60 minutes, but anyway, that's good. So inside of SageMaker, if we scroll down to inference and we look at compilation jobs, we should see in here probably quite a lot of things from the many and varied tests that I've done. But here at the top, starting is currently a compilation job, which is happening for Linux ARM64. This is the one that we've just kicked off from our notebook. So we can go back to our notebook and we can see that it's currently in the process of compiling. This will return to us when it's finished doing that. Let's go back to Panorama while it's doing that, have a look around here and see what's happened. So let's go back up to the top level of devices. We see here that we have our device, My Panorama, it's online. Nothing much to see here. We click into the actual device itself. Similarly, not a lot to see. What we can see though is that we've got deployed applications. So it does know about applications that are already running on this device. And we can see obviously deleted applications. We don't have any of those either yet. So we can see the status of the device. The question is, can we go through the process of actually deploying applications through the console? Because at the moment, everything looks like it works through the Panorama CLI, and the tooling that we have inside of that notebook makes all that easy for us, and so certainly helps us with that process. So that's devices, data sources are there. So these aren't necessarily set up specifically for this device. They are set up in general inside of Panorama, and deployed applications, similar kind of view to the view that we had before. So let's go back to our Jupyter Notebook environment, our Jupyter Lab. It's still compiling. Let's come back to this when it's finished. And there you go. So about 5 minutes is what that took to compile, and it's spat out a nice done inside of there. If we go over to SageMaker and do a quick refresh there, then I'm assuming that's going to say complete too. Yeah, excellent. All right, so let's continue on with this. Once that's now been compiled, that's going to be compiled up in AWS somewhere, so we can now download it again to our environment. So I'm just going to click go on that. And because we had all of that stuff set up with those variables right at the top of the notebook, we don't have to change a lot of this code. We can just run it, which is pretty useful. So now, in order for the Panorama device and the code to actually make use out of this, certainly on this box, if we're going to play around with it, and we are going to play around with it, we basically just need to unzip that. So the format of the model as per normal when you transport these things around is a tar gzip. So it's basically just going to explode that out onto the machine that we have here. Into the EC2 instance that we have here. And then we get to prepare the model for deploying to the Panorama device itself. So there's a few different steps that we have to do for that. This first one is just getting the command line environment ready on this machine. Then we're going to set up some names of some variables that we want to run. And then we run, again, the Panorama CLI. And in this case, we're running add raw model. So right back at the beginning, we started off the package, the process of creating the application. And with this, we're adding the raw model into that application stack. So it knows where it is and what to do with it. And it's passing in a bunch of details there about where it can find that. It spits out a bunch of stuff, but ultimately we have successfully downloaded the model to this particular location on the EC2 instance that I'm currently running. And you'll notice that it's given it this really long name. Let's clear up the command line environment again so that we can use it again in the future. But now we have everything that we need. We've got the model on inside of our environment. So let's go and take a look, see if we can find it. So we go to samples. I'm going to navigate up into people counter, and we'll go back into people counter app. And if we go in there, this is where we were before. If we go into assets, we can now see that we've got these two files here, and these two files here basically represent the model that we're using. If we navigate out and go back out to people counter, right, let's progress and see what happens next. Next, in the notebook, we have this pretty large cell, which is full of code. This is the actual code which is going to run on the device. This is the actual Panorama application itself. And you'll notice that it's got this run and save app.py. Basically, the code that's inside of this cell will be saved out to a separate app.py file, and that is the actual Python code that ultimately should be sent to the box. But we can run it inside of the notebook so we see how well it works. So just before we do that, let's remind ourselves of a couple of things that we set right back at the top of the notebook. A couple of things up here. One, obviously, is the actual model name itself. These are the kinds of things that we can change. The other is this town center xvid.avi. This is a video that's installed on this EC2 instance, and it's that's going to be used as the dummy camera running this code inside of this notebook. If I go back into samples, I go into Panorama SDK, and if I go into videos, well, there are a bunch of videos there with town center xvid.avi right there. So we're going to perform inference essentially over that. And if we want to replace the video, as we absolutely do, then we'll put our own video into here in just a moment. So let's scroll back down to that code. Here it is. It is the entire inference application. So it has its functions in here for processing the streams, for grabbing the media, for processing the results. And you'll see in results here, it's actually got some code for drawing over the top of the output before it ultimately sends it out, so we can draw bounding boxes over, and we can specify exactly what bounding boxes we want, what labels we want. If we want to add extra text to the display, we can do that there as well. So let's go ahead and run this quite large cell. So shift enter on that, and here we go. We're now making inference over this video file that's on this machine. So you can see that it's got bounding boxes around some of the individuals, some of the people in this actual video, and just about in there you can see a counter. It says people and the number of people that it's currently counting in this video. Now, there are a couple of issues with this. One is that the color isn't quite right. There is a color mapping issue with some of the test code, which is inside of this notebook server. That's something that's relatively easily fixed. The other thing is, after 30 frames, this is going to fall over, and that's because there's another issue with the code as well. I can fix both of those things. If this happens in your environment, then get in touch with me, and I can help you and walk you through how to fix both of those things up. In principle, though, in essence, we have working code working inside of this Panorama test utility. But let's show how we can change the video around, change the code around. I'm not so much interested in counting people right at the moment. Let's say that we want to count cars. So let's stop this. So I click the stop button. I'm also going to say kernel, restart and clear all outputs. and click restart. Because if you want to change significant things about this notebook, you do have to restart. But you don't have to run the whole thing again. You just have to run basically the first 3 cells for the configuration items and the variables and the like, and then you can go back and run the code. You don't have to do the model compilation again unless you change the model. So let's scroll back to the top up here and have a look at where we define where the video is again. So that's here. And I'm going to upload my own video into here. And I've got a couple of videos, so let's just grab both of those and just literally drag them into the Jupyter environment and click back into here. So with that video uploaded and with these first 3 cells run again, including changing the name of the video in there, then we scroll down and we're ready to run the actual inference code itself again. But before we do this, I just want to make a quick change here. So at the moment it's got self class IDs equals 14. And this is basically using a pre-trained model that's trained on a number of different things, and if you dig around on the internet you can find the different labels of the things it'll count. Cars are one, bicycles are another, people, sofas, monitors, TVs, that kind of thing. It's one of those kinds of models. So let's say as well as counting people, I also want you to count cars, and I happen to know that that's label number 6. So let's see if we can just add that in. I want to count people and cars. Let's scroll down and elsewhere in the code, let's make a quick change here as well. Specifically here, this is where it sort of shows you how many people it's found. This is where it puts it into logs. So let's just say things, and let's say things here. And that's obviously what it's going to show in the interface. Let's see if that works. So it's basically looking now for 2 different types of things, not just people. So let's go ahead and run this code and see it now hopefully performing inference over a new video, the video that I recently uploaded. And here we go. Now you'll notice that the text is much bigger than it was before. That's because the video itself is much lower resolution. I've just actually brought this down out of Kinesis video streams. These cameras stream to Kinesis video streams. Nothing to do with Panorama whatsoever, but it's just an easy way for me to grab video from it. And you can see that it's got 1 car here, which it's got a bounding box around. We've got another car, which is in the process of driving up the driveway. And whenever it's sort of not really behind a tree, it's also drawing a bounding box around that as it comes up. So we're showing here that this code that we've got does work with the kinds of streams that I have coming out of the camera. We're doing all of this, but we haven't gone and actually deployed the code to the actual Panorama device yet. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see what's involved with doing that. So we'll scroll down here. What I might do is actually stop this cell from running. You notice it does run super low frame rate, right? Because it's obviously pushing these frames. It's doing the inference over US East 1. It's pushing each of the frames through a Jupyter notebook, which is not designed for showing live video streams. So come on, stop that. Stop it. I'm gonna restart the kernel and clear the outputs. See if we can get it. There we go. All stopped. So I'll just scroll right to the very top and I'll run those first 3 cells again. And by doing that, we've got all of those variables that we needed. Let's scroll all the way down then and see what we can do about deploying this to this actual device itself. We're actually kind of getting to the point here. So there's the code. It's now saved out. If I go back into samples, people counter, we've got app.py, and you'll notice that was made 2 minutes ago. So that's the actual code that we were working on inside of the Jupyter notebook. So we're essentially using this as a development environment for what we're going to deploy. Now we're going to go into package the app, and you'll notice that what it does here is it's using this update descriptor function inside of utils. So let's just see what that's going to be doing. It's just updating a file that's inside of the app package. So we'll allow it to do that. Again, a convenience function. Now it's saying to update the camera streams. So here is where it's asking us to put in the details about the camera streams we have such that it can deploy to the model. Now, the environment already knows about the camera streams, so exactly what this does remains to be seen. But let's follow the bouncing ball. We'll do what it asks for. So it's asking for a stream URL and it's asking for the username and password. which means I'm just going to have to put it bang into this Jupyter Notebook. Again, don't do this in a production environment. Don't do this with sensitive cameras. I think there are other ways to do this with camera overrides and stuff. As you can see, overriding camera node there. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's do this then. So I'll say root, I'll put in the password. There's the password to my cameras. Probably going to have to change that now, aren't I? And a stream URL. So let's go and grab one of them. Let's give it a URL for the camera that's out the front of the house. So that's in there. So let's set that up. I've got the username and the password and the actual stream URL. And it's given it a name of test RTSP camera. That's fine for the moment. So let's just configure that. It's saying it doesn't like what I've done. I think it's got a line break here. Let's just fix that up and run that again. That's better. Just a syntax problem. Then we're using the AWS command line. So the AWS command line, not the AWS Panorama CLI. And we're going to call Panorama create node from template job. Push that into Panorama through the AWS CLI. So let's run that. And here I think we can just check what we've done here. We're going to run AWS Panorama describe node from template job. So let's do that. Okay, next in this notebook, it's talking about overriding the camera node. And it's basically saying here, if you want to override the camera configuration at deployment, which ultimately we want to do because we don't want to have to type in the username and password like that all the time, then we can go to a particular file, which is inside of the folder up here, the People Counter app as it stands in this particular application. We can go into deployment overrides and into the JSON file, the override file, and put in details about our camera there. But seeing as this is saying it's an override function, I'm not going to do that right now. I think that I don't have to do that. So I'm going to skip on to the next section, which is building the container for the app. Because underlying all of this is Docker. That's the other requirement that you have for putting this stuff together. It puts it into a Docker container and sends it over to the device. So that's what it's going to do here. There's Docker running on this actual EC2 instance. So let's Shift Enter on that. Oh, and that sets up the command line environment. Then Shift Enter on this one, where we're using the Panorama CLI this time, which itself essentially is wrapping up the AWS CLI. And it is going off now and building that Docker container. And there's all normal kinds of Docker kind of output here as it's downloading the image and making the customizations to it to build our own particular container. So let's let it walk through that process. And that seemed to take quite a long time. Most of the time was actually spent zipping up the resulting container. And the next step of what we need to do is to actually package the application. And I'm just going from what I'm reading here. So we're actually running Panorama CLI package application. So let's clean up our command line, go ahead and run that code. And it's now going to run that CLI utility. Again, what it's doing here is abstracting you away from the AWS CLI. So it's doing a whole bunch of steps, uploading, downloading, pushing to S3, doing stuff, packaging the container. And that says that it's completed successfully. So let's just clear up the command line environment. And I think we're pretty close now, right? So now it's saying that we're ready to deploy to the actual device itself. So, well, I guess this is it. So this first cell here is saying, let's make sure that the device is actually available. And it seems to be yes. So it's found the device. This is doing the check that the device ID that we entered at the very beginning of this notebook actually was valid. So that's good to know after all this time. Let's go ahead now and deploy. We got this preparation step. And then this is the ultimate part here by the looks of it. We've got AWS Panorama create application instance, pass in everything. So this is the actual command line. Again, notice that this is using the AWS CLI. Shift Enter. Off it goes. How long is this going to take? Apparently there's an error message. All right, let's have a look at that. Scroll to the bottom. Expecting value, line 1, column 1. Oh dear, what's going on here? Okay, interesting thing here. When you look at this error message, what it's actually telling me is that it can't find this particular camera package, even though I know that camera package was created inside of my account. But if you look at the account ID here, that's not my account ID. That's someone else's. So what's actually happened here, I think, is that the stuff that we were looking at above here, where it talked about camera overrides, it was saying, where was that? It was around here. So I actually did this section here, if you remember. What this did here with create a new camera was it actually set up a camera inside of the console or inside of the AWS service. So if I go to data sources, as I've got here, you can actually see that test RTSP camera was actually set up in addition to the ones that I'd set up before. That's what that API call did. I reran this line here, which was describing the node, and you'll see it says successful, it's version 2, it's all of that kind of stuff, but it's in my account, not whatever account that was. Now, this stuff that down here, the next stuff down, it says overriding the camera node. If you want to override the camera node into camera configuration, then do some stuff here. And it does talk about replacing the account ID, the account ID and your camera name in there. Now, I didn't want to override the camera. I was fine with the way it was set above. But it turns out I think we actually have to do that. And maybe we'll do that by running this cell here, which is something I didn't actually do. So let's run that cell and let's go and have a look at the camera overrides. I've opened up a bunch of stuff up here. So let's go and right click on that and open with the editor. And yeah, and now it's actually updated it with my actual account ID. So I think that's what the issue was there. All right, so I guess the thing here is run every cell. This cell here is important even if you don't want to override the camera node. That's a bit annoying, but never mind. We just have to go through a process again now, I would assume, of building the container and then zipping it all up and then getting it ready for deploy. So let me race through that and do that all over again. Okay, so we're back to the point now where we're going to deploy to the device. Hopefully this works this time. So again, just make sure the device is ready. Yes, it is. We're going to get ready, deploy, and right, now we're going to run the actual deployment code again. Let's see what happens this time. So it hasn't come straight back with that error message, thankfully. Yeah, it's come back with positive result, which presumably means that the application is being deployed to this device as we speak. We have a way here to check the status, so let's go ahead and run that. And what's it telling us? Nothing much. It's telling us the instance ID by the looks of it. It looks as though it's going through a loop and it's going to wait for this to actually get deployed. So let's jump over to the actual Panorama console here. Let's go to devices. Let's go to my Panorama device here. And whoop, there we go. It's in the state of currently deploying the application to this running device here from the camera, which is on the front of the house. It says here that it's going to take up to 15 minutes. I guess it's deploying the actual Docker container. It's downloading the Docker container onto here and going through all of that setup process. So I guess now we wait again. Oh, I think the deployment process is finished because it's stopped. This has stopped. And this has... Do we have to wait now again? What is the application starting? Wah! And there we go. Fantastic. So we can see here we've got two things. Thing 1 and thing 2, the two cars here. And it's got, I can just about see it, the overlay there that says 2 things. So there we go. We've managed to go all the way through from actually taking this out, provisioning it for the very first time, and actually deploying an application by using the application that was provided in the sample code in this Jupyter notebook in the test utility, which has been made available for us by the Panorama team. The key thing here is that all of the steps that you need to actually deploy your application are contained within this app and within this particular notebook. So the compilation of the model, and then the actual inference code itself, and then how to use the Panorama CLI to package all that up and then push it out to the device. We can now see that it's running on the device, and there's not a lot that we can do with that here. We can delete the application, we can make some changes there, and now that the application's running on the device, we can see some of the details in the console. So we've got the details here. We've also got inputs and parameters. So from here, we can see which streams it's taking in. And this parameter here, this threshold, which you actually have a look in the code, is actually being exposed out through that graph as being one of the variables which is used inside of the code. Now, can we actually go from here and edit that? It doesn't appear so. Can we go in through the command line? Maybe. That'll have to be something that we look up in the documentation. So I best get outside. Hang on. Well, there really isn't any way for me to know whether this is going to work because I don't know, but hopefully it is. You can see the bounding box being drawn around the two cars. Hopefully you can see one drawn around me as well. So now, is it saying 3 things? Hopefully it is. Look, I think this video has gone on for long enough now, and hopefully you've managed to see a little bit about how Panorama works, how we managed to take the code, in this case, that's been running inside of that Jupyter Notebook example, the sample code for people counting. Obviously, we've made it do something different. You can bring your own models in, of course, your own trained models, and work with your own projects in AWS Panorama as well. If you've got any questions about Panorama, then please put them in the comments below. If you've got any ideas for other projects that could be set up on Panorama, then put those in the comments below as well. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.